All right, we're on Module 5, Lecture 3. We first two lectures focused on immune system. Second lecture, kind of the stress systems, how they're combined. We talked about appraisal. We talked about the consequences of stress, kind of the processes of stress and immune functioning, etc., etc. So we're on the home stretch here. Ultimately, as you can see, anxiety, America's #1 mental health problem. Of course, anxiety and stress are closely related. A number of studies. I'm not going to go into detail on each one of them. I'm just trying to show you that when you're stressed, you're less likely to do health behaviors. For kids, the process is similar. High-stressed kids ate more fatty foods. Women who experience high stress exercise less and enjoy it less. Psychological stress can lead to greater expression of illness, for example, the flu. Long-term unrelenting stress on mothers damages DNA of their immune system that speeds up the aging process. I think that's covered in the stress documentary. In sum, negative experience of stress leads to disease, chronic behaviors that are not good for our health, poor quality of life, inability to perform behaviors linked to positive physical health. So, for example, if you're high stress, even exercise is problematic. So they say, of course, exercise to help you cope with stress, but when you're experiencing stress, you're less likely to exercise. So it's kind of a catch-22, and we talk a little bit about this in Module 2 on motivation. Ultimately, it kind of comes down to this. How do you handle all this potential stress to avoid the negative long-term health consequences? What's the answer? Well, many people say just cope, just meditate, just exercise, just eat right. Cope, and coping, and more coping. The problem with that is that you're continually coping with chronic stress. So that's not really a fun-filled life. So how do you really kind of reverse this process? Can you reverse this process? These are some of the things I've been trying to study, both from a personal interest, but also just my professional interest has been on kind of the flourishing side of life and how people perform optimally, how they live optimally, what that's like, how do you do it, so on and so forth. So how does one do this? Why would one do this? So on and so forth. Just one quick quote from a famous actor. I watch the Actor Studio a lot. I won't read the whole quote, but look, the world is dark. It's as bad as it gets. But this person kind of tends to focus on the good stuff, right? Where's the joy? Where's the spirit? Where's the fun? That's the goldsmith. He says that people tend to focus on the negative and the dark side. But if you're doing it artfully, yes, we must all do that. But I find it much more interesting to find out where the joy is. That's the key. Can you find the joy in all the crap that goes on? Right? How do you reinterpret that crap as good stuff? And that's really the key. That's the ultimate key. And this, of course, famous actor is John Travolta. And he's gone through some heartache and hardship losing a child. So he kind of knows what he's talking about, as do others as well. So can you do more than just cope? And that's where we're kind of ending with a flourish. Flourishing, positive affect, high well-being seem to reduce and buffer stress. So in your exam question, again, you're going to be asked to kind of give the basics of how the stress, immune response, and disease, and then how can any of these flourishing concepts that we're going to go over, how can that flourishing buffer that system or those systems or even change it? Well, what is flourishing? Well, again, you're going to find a variety of definitions, but it's just the state of well-being in which you're continually kind of realizing or optimizing your own abilities. You can cope with normal stressors and you're working productively and fruitfully, and you make a contribution to your community. Now, flourishing sounds good, but unfortunately, less than 2 in 10 adults, 17%, were what you would consider completely mentally healthy, meaning really, truly flourishing. So we've got a long way to go in terms of flourishing, primarily because we focus so much on just coping with stress. But I think if you remember way back to Era 3.0 in the first module from Dr. Breslow, right, this age of fruitful living, perhaps we're getting into it now. And I'm not going to show you the figures on flourishing at this point. You're probably a little brain dead from listening to these lectures. But flourishing does have significant health implications. What happens when we flourish? some ways of flourishing in life. There's been a study that looked at what they call eudaimonic well-being, which is just one way of looking at flourishing. They found in a study of older women who scored high on this eudaimonic well-being, they had lower levels of cortisol released, lower levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, lower risk for cardiovascular disease, and they had better sleep. So when you do flourish, it does seem like biologically there's some good things that happen. So you're not just coping with stuff, you're flourishing, you're thriving. And so with this little figure here, typically with like the biomedical model, or even with coping, you're just trying to get from a negative state to neutral. Well, that only goes so far. What we're really talking about is how do you get to this positive state, right? And if you do and can get to this positive state, some good stuff happens as far as helping with stress response, helping with immune system functioning, and so forth. And there's really two aspects of flourishing that we're going to focus on here. The readings, the three readings, number 12, 13, and 14, all get into this, but we're going to focus on positive emotions and flow. And let's see how quickly I can do that. So Dr. Fredrickson talks about positive emotions or positive affect. When you live kind of more with these positive emotional life, it tends to broaden people's thoughts so that you're more likely to actually pursue things that might be good for you. And you also build, when you have positive emotions, you can build on your resources, and you can see how this is a biopsychosocial perspective, right? So living this positive emotional life can be very helpful for disease reduction, performing health behaviors. For example, positive emotions can facilitate health behavior change. And we're not just talking about thinking positive. We're really talking about fun, joy that you can get through play, which really helps to kind of lead this more positive emotional life. So in sum, positive emotions can trigger this upward spiral towards optimal functioning. So how can you figure out how to lead this positive emotional life? Well, relaxation, meditation, and visualization. Finding and experience the meaning and purpose in your life. So when people say go find what you like, do it. Engaging activities that are playful and fun. Why? Because that frees you up. That kind of gives those feelings of autonomy and freedom, which lead to a positive emotional life. And participating and engaging in what the experts would call flow-like activities. And what is flow? Flow-like activities do relate to flourishing. People who experience flow typically lead lives of quiet inspiration. So what is flow? Flow is, and you probably all have had it in some way, it's kind of this state of complete absorption in a task where you kind of lose self-consciousness, your performance is elevated, sometimes people call it in the zone, for lack of a better thing. It's not just reserved for athletics. For example, I can get into the zone when doing these lectures. I can get in the zone when I'm in a classroom. I can get in the zone when I'm writing, right? It's this complete state of absorption or engagement in a task. Now, why is that a good thing to have? And you can think about it in your own life when you might do that. It's good to have these flow states or get into flow because typically your mood is better because you're doing something really for kind of this intrinsic, for its own sake. You have this feeling of autonomy. You're totally into it. When you come out of it, you're like, wow, that was pretty cool. So your mood is elevated. Your emotional life is enhanced. So the experience of engagement, really engagement, leads to positive emotional life, which can help with stress, which can help with disease risk reduction. Typically, they look at it from this kind of flow in terms of these challenges and the skills. And again, the exam is going to ask you to kind of get into one of these concepts to write it a little bit about, so you'll need to get in there a little bit more. But typically, when your challenges and skills are balanced, you perceive something as challenging, but you also have the skills to do it, that's a good chance of getting into flow. Now, I've studied flow for a lot of years. I've read it. I've actually done research on it. It sounds good, and it is good. The problem is that the literature basically shows, and you can find this out in the reading, that few people get into flow. And you can think a little bit about your own life right now in terms of how often is your mind totally into one thing? Or is it constantly split? Is your mind always split? Are you distracted? Are you distracted by your phone when you're trying to read? Are you distracted by the TV when you're trying to engage in a conversation. So there's a lot of work that you have to do to actually get yourself into flow. So it takes energy and motivation to put oneself into flow-like activities. And where does this energy come from? Well, this is what gets into this idea of well-being, in that you have to be living a life of kind of quiet inspiration so that you find the moments where you actually get into flow. And I end with a lot of words here on the page, on the screen. But so really, how do you find and grow meaning and well-being in your life? How do you flourish? We know what flourishing is, kind of, but honestly, we don't know much about how to do it for ourselves, because everyone and everything keeps telling us it's not important, or how to do it, or distracting us from it. This is true. Our culture is not designed for us to get into flow, or to really engage, or to have positive emotional life. It's really, honestly, the consumer culture is designed to have you spend money. Because that keeps the culture and society going, which is not really an optimal way to live life. But it is very difficult to heighten mood and lose ourselves in activities because our conscious mind holds us back. It's very difficult to create our own meaning because we've been told throughout our lives by parents, teachers, friends, and so forth how we should be living our lives. Honestly, health experts try to tell us what we should be doing with our health behaviors, right? I'm not saying we shouldn't, but we have to ultimately build our own life. And that is flourishing, right? Really knowing what you want, going after it, not in a selfish way, but that's because who you are. And you won't do that if you're continually distracted by all this other stuff. So it is very difficult to create our own meaning because we're taught to think and analyze and judge and so forth, and get approval from other people, our parents. We want love. And all of that, the conscious mind, the rational mind, the mind of reason, kind of falls short. And we really can't get into these flow states or optimally engage when we kind of have this mindset. So coping isn't enough. Flourishing is really kind of where it's at, but it's also difficult to get there. And our culture doesn't really promote getting there. In fact, it doesn't really want us to get there, because when we get there, we'll realize that all the other stuff we're pursuing is really not all that important, and it's just filling other people's pockets, right? So you need to figure out a way, and this you can just kind of start paying attention to your own life a little bit more carefully, is you have to step outside of this rational mind. And I know I'm getting to kind of a little bit more philosophical, heavy-duty stuff here at the end, but you got to kind of access this unconscious mind, which is kind of getting more into the feel of the experience, right? And Walt Disney really understood this. We must find ourselves and then make ourselves vulnerable to experience and grow that clean, unspoiled spot that is unique to each of us. In essence, become ourselves. So ultimately, we end kind of at the beginning, because to become ourselves right now in 2014 is very difficult to do. Not impossible, but you have to really kind of be true to yourself, not in a selfish way, but really not be too distracted by what other people are telling you to do with your career or your classes or your relationships, but what ultimately makes you feel like you can be yourself. And that's the greatest challenge in the world, but also can bring the greatest joy. And that's really the end of K&H 329. Of course, you've got the exam, but I just really wanted to end with kind of maybe having you think a little bit more about how you want to live, how you want to be, and go out there and do it. So thanks for listening to all of these lectures. Hopefully they were somewhat helpful, and go out and flourish.